All right, so I have to get used to this technology a bit because it's my first time doing a presentation via live stream. So while you can see my presentation, I'm not able to see you if you fall asleep or something like that. Uh, so I don't know how we handle questions or something like that. I have a question answer part at the end of the presentation, or if you want to ask some questions during the presentation, I think that's fine as well. Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, my name is Thomas Steinmaurer. I'm at the SCCH in Austria doing projects with databases, data warehousing. Currently, I'm involved in a project using Hadoop and HBase for building a project with up to tera petabyte of data storage. Beside the regular day job, I'm involved in the Firebird project since its beginning, doing well, helping out people in the support list, the various support lists, writing articles, being at different conferences, presenting topics on the Firebird relational database. Today, I'm gonna show you the Trace API, which has been introduced in Firebird 2.5, and how you can use the Trace API with our FB Trace Manager product by Upstream Productions. It's a company based in the Netherlands. Possibly you know Upstream Productions from other products like Database Workbench or something like that. So, well, that's just to my person. Well, that's the agenda. I was told that presentation should be around 45 minutes, so I should have been able to just talk about the FB Trace Manager product in the whole session, but I thought that probably a mix of giving you an introduction to the Trace API in general and a demonstration on the product is a good mix for you, so I hope this is okay for you. Well, first we're going to talk about things why the Trace API is interesting. There are different things we can discuss here. In the second part, I will give you a short introduction into the Trace API in general. So just to so that you get used to what the Trace API is, and in the third part, I'm gonna live demo the FB Trace Manager version 2 product with real world scenarios. We're gonna go to this back later what these scenarios might be. Well, if we are talking about database monitoring in general, there are usually different people, different roles interested in monitoring. First of all, database administrators, and of course developers as well. I think as this is a meeting with a Delphi User Group, I think most of you are developers. So you as a developer can make quite a lot out of it of the Trace API. And well, also the auditors, if you have some kind of security audits or something like that, the Trace API can deliver the data needed for the auditors. So that's probably a different role. So I guess in this session, we are going to concentrate more on the developer side. When talking about monitoring, probably this one isn't new for you, but in Firebird 2.1 there have been the monitoring tables introduced that are global temporary tables. If you gonna query them, you get a snapshot of the current activities for the database you are currently logged in. So you don't get a continuous stream with that. So if you want to have a continuous stream of what's happening in your database, you have to need some polling installed here. So basically with the monitoring tables, as you get a snapshot, you don't have a history available. But for many things, a history of what happened in the past on the database is quite important to detect and diagnose some problems. The history makes it more easily. Well, that's pretty much was what the Trace API delivers in Firebird 2.5. The Trace API gives you a stream of executed events with quite a lot of detailed information, and it provides the history of the activities in the database. And the nice thing about the Trace API is that it is server-side, so you don't have to add some kind of trace logic into your client application, or if you have a third-party product accessing your Firebird 2.5 database and you want to see what's going on, what the application is doing, for instance, in respect to the client transaction management and something like that, you are able to do that with the Trace API. So the Trace API delivers continuous trace events. It's configurable. We will see a little bit later how you can configure a trace session, and the server side is important here. Well, there's I just put a few bullets onto the slide here. The reference is a pretty good book on implementing database security and auditing. And then the author here categorized the auditing monitoring with different things. So, for instance, you might be interested in log on, log off scenarios into your database. You probably want to know which client application, which user, which I don't know, remote IP address or something like that has queried your database. So you are interested in the sources. So who is using the database? One thing you might be interested in is some kind of fraud detection. So if you want to detect usage of your database outside normal operating hours, this might be suspicious. So this is a use case here. You also want to probably have to trace the DDL activity. So if someone alters a stored procedure or creates a table or something like that. Database errors is another thing. Yeah, changes to the stored procedures and triggers is something I already have mentioned. Also important is changes to privileges and user login definitions. And different things like the usage of database links and replication. Database links is not a concept Firebird is currently supporting. Another one is changes to sensitive data. So if you want to keep track of who has changed the salary for a particular employee, this might be a use case, might be a category here as well. Of course, if someone queries private data, you might be interested in that as well. And the last point is if someone changes the definition of what to audit, this is something you usually have to keep track as well. That's just some points in general. Firebird with DML triggers, the monitoring tables, the Trace API, and the DDL triggers, which are expected to appear in Firebird 3.0, can pretty much cover all points here, except auditing database errors. It's probably not possible with these things. So, well, getting back a bit to real-world examples for the Firebird 2.5 Trace API, beside the auditing categories in the previous slide. Well, you can identify full table scans. So you can identify your worst performing queries in respect to the execution time. You can identify the most frequently executed statements. So if you want to know the 10 most frequently executed statements and you're running a trace session, you're able to identify those, and you might concentrate on optimizing these statements before optimizing some other statements. You can identify queries lower than a certain threshold. You also can identify long-living statements. So if you have a prepared statement which lasts for 1 or 2 days or whatever, you are able to capture this. Firebird being you have to take care of as a developer in your client application to have a proper client transaction management, so that all those interesting transactions, all those active transactions can move forward. So what the Trace API allows you here is to trace what kind of transaction, if you're using, for instance, commit retaining or rollback retaining or something like that, you can capture this as well, and you probably are able to spot a faulty client transaction management here. What's also important is you can inspect the I/O patterns for per executed statements. So you will see how many reads from disk have been done, how many fetches from the cache, from the Firebird cache, how many writes to the disk, and how many marks, so how many pages in the cache have been invalidated. So that's a very important input for instance, for sizing the Firebird page cache. So you might be able to detect if your Firebird page cache is too low, so you might be able to increase that. The list continues. You can check if you're using prepared statements. It's also possible, which is rather neat, is that you can detect if an executed statement issued garbage collection. So, for instance, if you had a rather slow statement which was fast, for instance, yesterday, it's got slow today, and it's fast again in 2 hours or whatever. I'm sorry? Is it fine? Yeah? Okay, so, okay, that's fine. Well, the garbage collection issue is very important, especially if you're running a Firebird architecture like Super Classic or Classic Server, where cooperative garbage collection is issued. Your statement, your SQL statement, might be slow if it needs to garbage collect old back record versions. So you can detect with the Trace API if garbage collection happened, to spot if the SQL statement is slow in general, or probably if garbage collection has been issued in context of the statement as well. What you also can do, as you get the execution plan per statement with the Trace API, you can check if a particular index is used. You can use the Trace API for some kind of fraud detection. So you can detect if, for instance, there have been a failed or unauthorized access, or as they already mentioned, access at unusual times. So this might be an interesting input if you have a security audit in your company with a Firebird database. Well, you can have all sort of statistics then. For instance, number of executed statements per IP address, per remote process, per use, or whatever. So you are able to identify peak loads. You can identify what was the most loaded database on the server. So that's very, very useful. Another thing is black box debugging. Black box debugging is just the example I gave already. Is if you have a third-party application and you want to know what the client application is doing with the database, just fire off the Trace API and you're ready to go, and you will see what statements the third-party application is executed. Well, and yeah, the trace output as an input for a security audit. Well, I'm gonna do a quick start demonstration on just to see what the trace output looks like. So what we have here is, let's see, there is a new command line utility in the Firebird 2.5 distribution called FB Trace MGR. You're able to use that with some parameters, and for instance, to start the trace session, you just provide the start option. You give it a session name, a trace session name, and important, you have to provide a configuration file or a configuration text here. If we go into this one here, we will see that there are a few configuration options used here. I'm going to discuss this one here a bit later. I guess we just start the trace session. All right. Let's see. Okay, there is something wrong here. I used the, let's see. That is different directory. So let's give it another try. All right, so the trace session started now. So if we go into a client here, client application, and just issue, we already see the attached database trace event, for instance, because I've opened the connection to the database. And if we're now running a select statement from an application, we will see that the trace session now captures those events, and we get, depending on the configuration parameters you have used when starting the trace session, you will see that the transaction has been started with quite some useful client information. For instance, this is the client, the remote process, the transaction isolation level, and some other stuff. So that's pretty much what the Trace API delivers. You will also see that, for instance, the statement took 140 milliseconds to execute, the number of reads from disk, and the number of fetches from the Firebird page cache. So that's just a very quick demonstration on what you can expect from the data. We'll see a little bit more in the FB Trace Manager product demonstration. Well, so let's talk about the Trace API in general. There are other third-party products out there which allow you to trace the executed statements. They usually follow some kind of proxy approach, so they are intercepting the network traffic between your client and the Firebird server, and are able to trace the executed statements. The good thing about the Trace API is that when you use Firebird 2.5, it's available out of the box across all architectures. So it's available in Super Server, Classic Server, and Super Classic on all supported platforms of the Firebird server, so on Windows, Linux, or whatever. The Trace API gives you a chronological sequence of the executed events, and there are different event types supported. There are database specific event types like connect, disconnect to a database. If there is a transaction start, commit, rollback, you want to be able to capture this. Statements in general, if a statement gets prepared, if a statement gets started, if it's finished, you all get this information. The same for stored procedures and triggers, including always the execution plan if you're interested in, the I/O statistics and more. And another event type are server-wide event types. For instance, if you want to trace when someone backups your database, or if someone restores the database, you are able to capture this with the server-wide events. So you have to be aware when using the Trace API. Then there are two different ways to use the Trace API. There is you can use it as a system audit, as a so-called system audit, and you can use it as a user trace. The main difference is that a system audit will be started by the Firebird engine when the server starts. It stores the trace output in a text file on the server, and you have to activate a system audit by using the new configuration parameter, the audit trace config file parameter in the firebird.conf file. And there only can be one system audit per Firebird instance. So if you're interested in a continuous trace which starts automatically with the Firebird server, you are probably using the system audit. So you get a trace in a text file, and you have to analyze the text file afterwards. The other thing is the user trace. A user trace is pretty much that every user can start a user trace. The trace output. So if you start a user trace, as we have seen in the example with the command line utility, the client, the trace client, waits for occurring trace events. So it's reading the trace events then. The thing is that if the Firebird server restarts or crashes or whatever, or if you restart the server, you have to manually start the user trace session again. So it won't get started automatically as it is when you're using the system audit. And last but not least, there can be several user traces per Firebird instance. We will see that with the FB Trace Manager demonstration a bit later. The trace configuration is just text, so you pretty much specify what you are interested in. There is a bunch of trace configuration parameters available. There is one template file included in the Firebird distribution called fbtrace.conf, which can be used as some kind of template file if you're serious with running a trace session with the command line utility. Yeah, well, so just a simple example how such a trace configuration can look like. You have, for instance, you have one general database section here with the configuration parameter enabled is set to true. What you are now able to is to some kind of override such parameters in database specific entries in the configuration file. Then, for instance, if you want to trace a database called tourism.ftb, it automatically gets the enabled configuration parameter set to true, and you also specify that you're interested in tracing database attachment scenarios. Well, with the employee.ftb entry here, it's the enabled configuration parameter is set to false, so tracing won't happen here. So. All right. So there is a bunch of configuration parameters available. I don't want to go through all of them. If you are having a look in the fbtrace.conf file, which is included in the Firebird distribution, you will see a command on each of the configuration parameters. So you pretty much hopefully can easily figure out what the configuration parameter is doing. All right. In regard to the security, every user can start a trace session. The trace session is started using the so-called services API. The services API is something you have to use and you have to connect to the server. Upon connecting to the services manager, you have to define a user and a parser. So this user is then used for the security thing. So for instance, if you are connecting as a sysdba, sysdba can manage all other trace sessions. It can start its own user trace sessions, of course, but it also can manage all other trace sessions. If you're connecting as a non-sysdba user, then non-sysdba user only sees its own trace sessions and it only can manage its own trace sessions. So, all right. Well, again, back to the trace output. It's pretty much text, unstructured text, which is, well, you see what's going on, but the problem here is that it's not that easy to parse or to process afterwards. So beside the trace output, it's pretty much, it was one goal for the FB Trace Manager product to expose the Trace API in general for the end user more easily. The FB Trace Manager product will parse the trace output and brings it in a relational, in a grid style form, which allows you to understand more easily what events are happening and what detailed information each executed trace event is providing. So that was pretty much the motivation behind the FB Trace Manager product. Before going into the online demo here is gonna back to the real world examples here. So I don't know how many people of you are already using Firebird 2.5 or the Trace API in particular, or well, I could go on just with the FB Trace Manager demonstration, or if you have any preferences here, what you like me to present, I'm all ears. So I don't know if there are any preferences from your side here. Okay. All right. Well, that's the FB Trace Manager product, the main form. On the left hand side here, you will see that there you can register Firebird server with the usual things like the host name, the port on which the Firebird instance is running, and the username you want to use. So if you connect the server over here, you will see that there is already, here you have, do you see the mouse cursor? Yes. Do you see the mouse cursor? Yeah. Okay. Okay. On the top here, you see then the currently running trace sessions for a particular, for the connected server. So as we have started one trace session here, we also will see this one here. So if we're gonna close this one here, it should be gone. So you're also able to manage trace sessions which have not been started by FB Trace Manager. In this area here, you are able to define so-called trace projects. We have called it trace projects. If we go into here, is you're gonna see the trace configuration parameters here. So you don't need to write the trace configuration file or trace configuration by hand. So we provide the properties you need here, and just to define a trace project. And well, if you are done with defining a trace project, it's just simply starting a trace session. So now let's see. We have seen the trace output or the command line utility already. So if we're gonna do another statement here, we will see that we also support, of course, the so-called row output here with some additional things like a color when a new trace event started, with just kind of code folding here, and yeah, well, it's just better to inspect. More interesting is the parser, the included parser, which passes the trace output and brings it into a grid style form. So for instance, it's now more easily to see what's really going on here. So for instance, we have an execute statement start with the select statement, select star from customer. There has been this execution plan used for accessing the data. For the execute statement finish events type here, we also have detailed statistics. For instance, you get some kind of information, how many records or how many records have been accessed naturally, so without an index, or how many records have been accessed with an index, and so on. So you get a lot of information out of it. Of course, you also get the execution time, the number of marks, the number of fetches, the number of reads, so some kind of I/O statistics, and you also get the information about the remote client here. For instance, the username, the role name, so the connection information, the remote process name, so it's the FSQL command line utility which accesses the database, in what transaction isolation mode, and so on. So I don't have any other internet applications open. So well, so you get a lot of it out of it here. The grid thing here is able that you can enter regular expressions. So for instance, if you're just interested in execute start events, you are able to define a regular expression. The default regular expression per project can be predefined in the project options here. So if you have a set of regular expressions you want to have applied automatically every time you start a trace sessions, you can define it in the project options. So if we rerun this statement here, you will see that the regular expression. Make sure that you only see this one here. All right. That's pretty much the parser. The parser was quite a challenge because the trace output, it's as already mentioned, is some kind of semi-structured text. It's undocumented, so that was quite a challenge, but it works pretty good now. Well, the thing here is if you're interested in let's delete the regular expression. You can also store the parsed and the received events in the included FB Trace Manager database. So if you want to inspect the traced events afterwards with some kind of select statements, you are able to do that because the log to database option here, if it is selected, make sure that the received trace data is stored in the FB Trace Manager database. So if we are going to the included browse module, of course it's again a Firebird database, the FB Trace Manager database, so you can query this as any other database. There is a simple browse module included here to just to see what has been stored in the FB Trace Manager database. There's a question I'm gonna answer right now. There is if there is a long-running transaction, you don't get some warning here. What you can do with the sequence here, if you go back to the parsed output, what you can do is you can, for instance, let me see, where's the transaction ID? There it is. What you can do is, yeah. I'm sorry? Yeah, right. Yeah. What you usually do if you have a long running transaction, or if you suffer from bad Firebird performance, you usually run the gstart command line utility showing you the header page of the Firebird database, because let's see, the database statistics. You're gonna see some data here in respect to these counters here. So the long-running transactions you're talking about is, you probably will see that the oldest transaction, the oldest active, these two here, are way behind the next transaction. So if this happens, you have a long-running transaction, and a long-running transaction you probably can be more easily spotted with the monitoring tables, right? Because you just query the $mon transactions monitoring table, and you will see what transactions open and what statements are executed in context of this transaction. Yeah. Sure. I think it is called transactions. This one here, I think. So. Yeah, well, we have a mon state here, which one is active, if I'm not wrong. And what you see here is you get the information per transaction, what's the oldest transaction, what is the oldest active transaction, and if you want to spot what statements are part of a particular transaction, you can query the mon statements table, and you have a reference to the transaction ID here, so you might get a good idea on what the long running transaction is and what it is currently doing. So that's a use case where the monitoring tables are probably are better suited for such kind of questions. Yeah. Paul, does this answer your question? think so. So I'm gonna continue here. Yeah, the trace penalty here. We have done a few tests, and what you usually see is when running a trace session that you get around 5% more CPU utilization for the server. Well, this is something our tests have shown. If you're running a system with quite a lot of users, and it could be more, yeah, but it should be quite okay. All right, we have seen the parser here and how to browse. So now let's get into some full table scan example, for instance. There is something called an FB Trace Manager called event processing. So as you have seen here, you get a regular stream of what's happening. That's convenient, but the thing is that you probably aren't able, especially with systems where quite a lot of actions is happening, you won't spot possible problems here. So we included something called event processing. Event processing is pretty much you're able to define a so-called event rule with some Pascal code here, and you in the event rule with the Pascal code here you have full access to the data in the grid. So for instance, if we're gonna activate this event rule here, which pretty much checks the event state column. So this column here, the event state column, which is here 0 every time. If it is 0, it's a statement which succeeded. If it is 1, it is failed. And if there's 2, then it was an unauthorized operation, for example, an unauthorized access to data. If we are going back here and we have activated the event rule, we have to reload the event rules. So now if we go back and select some statement here, we will see that the green. So every time the column is green, we can pretty much say the executed statement succeeded. Now, if we gonna execute something which, for instance, a table which doesn't exist, we should get event state with 1, so it failed. If we go to the row output here, we will see that there is a failed term included in the output here, and our event rule makes sure that it is colored with a different color. And more interesting, if it is some kind of unauthorized access, because let's see what user I have here. For instance, if I connect with a different user and want to select the statement access a table which I don't have any SQL privileges here, I see usually in the client you see something like no permission for read write. If we go back to the trace output, we will see that we get notified about that with an unauthorized term here, and the event rule makes sure that it is colored with red. So you get some kind of real-time or near real-time analysis capabilities here to spot certain conditions in the received data. And there are other things here. For instance, if back to the example with the full table scan, it's a very simple event rule here. If the execution plan includes the natural keyword here, if we want to have the execution plan column colored with a red background color. So if we gonna activate this one here and reload and execute a statement which produces a full table scan, for instance count star, we should see here, if we go to the execution plan column here, we will see that this one gets colorized according to our event rule. So that's pretty useful if you want to keep track of certain conditions in the data. Well, I could continue with a few examples here. For instance, if you are using commit retaining, which is more or less, if you do it over a long period of time, your Firebird server can suffer performance. You might get notified by that with some visualization here. So if we do that, and if we reload and we use commit retain now, our event rule has been defined in a way that the phone should be bold then. So that's another thing you can use the event processing. Of course, there are other types here. So another one is if you want to show an alert window, you can do that as well. Don't want to present this one here now. For instance, if the execution time is greater than 100 millisecond, an alert window should be shown. You're also able, there's another event rule type which allows you to execute an external application. For instance, if there is a commit retain and you want to get the header page with gstart, you are able to do that as well. And there is also a way to send an email. So for everything, for instance, for unauthorized access, or if you have some conditions you want to be notified immediately by email, you can do this here. So that's very powerful. Well, I think that's pretty much the examples. What we, as if I don't know how much time do I have. There's some kind of last thing is what's in. Okay. What we have covered the full table scan scenario. Oh, that's good. I had a breakfast 1 hour ago, so okay. Okay. Well, then have a look on the last example here, which a very common use case is identifying the worst performing queries. So if you have performance problems and if you have queries which take a long time to execute, as you can imagine, that's pretty much that's easy to identify with the Trace API. So that we don't get so much output here, I'm gonna concentrate on the most important things here. So what we want to do is we want to get statement statistics, we want to get the execution plan, some kind of detail, performance statistics. So if we run this trace session here, and let's disconnect to avoid some kind of Firebird page cache and reconnect. I'm gonna close the restart. It's more easily. So, well, I have a table with about, I think, 100,000 records. So if I do a select const star, which does full table scan, All right. We will see the SQL statement, the execution plan with our event processing rule in place. We see the execution time. It took about 144 milliseconds, and we also see the I/O statistics here. So we'll see the number of fetches from the cache, the number of reads from disk. So you get an impression here what the Firebird engine is doing to query the table on the get result set. So for instance, if we are running another statement and we basically want to identify the worst performing query here, you can either use the sorting capabilities here. So for instance, so that it stays on top. Or if you're somewhere in the middle, you can rearrange this one. If you're somewhere in the middle of your trace output here, you can use the aggregate stuff at the bottom here. So just right click, say maximum, what's the maximum, and then you can right click again and say set field, and you're identifying your worst performing query in the trace output very quickly here. Perhaps back to the I/O statistics, and then I'm gonna finish the presentation. As I've told, that you get an impression how much I/O is being done either from the Firebird page cache or the disk. So if, for instance, we rerun the select count statement here, we will see that it's pretty much the same. So if what we can try now is just as an exercise, we can connect to the database again, just to try a larger page cache. The FSQL command line utility provides a cache thing here. If I tell we want to use 50,000 pages for the page cache, and we gonna re-execute here in the first time, it should be pretty much the same because it's a new connection. It has to read data from the disk, and when you re-execute this one here, it should run. It should have less number of reads from disk, what is shown here. So execution time was a bit smaller as well. So that's an example. If you increase the page cache, how can it influence the executed statement in respect to reading from disk? So, well, there's another question here. Okay. No, I'm okay. Yeah, I'm pretty done with the demonstration here. Let's well, just a quick note on the additions, on the product edition, which I will. There is a light edition which is freely available. Everybody can download and use it. It's limited to local connections, so just for local Firebird instances, and you only get the row trace output, so no parser, no event processing or something like that. It's a pretty good replacement for the command line utility which is included in the Firebird package. Then there is a standard edition, which is the light edition, plus you can connect to remote databases. You have the parser included, so that you have the grid available, and you have the reporting stuff available, which wasn't able to show in this demonstration. Then there is the enterprise edition, which is pretty much the standard plus analysis things with some kind of OLAP cube, and there is the presented event processing module included. And there is also a trial edition, which is pretty much the enterprise edition limited to 30 days, and the number of received and parsed trace events is limited to a fixed number. So that's the additions. Well, okay. There are there are three options. The first option is, let me see. The first options is in the firebird.conf file. I think there is something called, let me search for another term, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, there is a default configuration option here per server instance. So if you use this one here, it's uncommented. So depending on the Firebird server architecture you're using, so super server or classic server, super classic, there is a default page cache in place per database. If it isn't set at database level. So there is also an option here at database level, which allows you to define the page buffers. If there is a value of 0, then the default page buffer value from the firebird.conf file applies. If you enter a value different to 0, then you have the page buffers value for this particular database. If you provide it at the database level here, all new connections use this value. So that's pretty much how it works. And there is a third one. It's also possible. It depends on what access components you are using for writing your application and so on. But for instance, there's a way to define a different page buffers value at the time when you connect to the database, some kind of temporary page buffers value for only this particular database connection, so without overwriting the value here. So that's pretty much what I've done here with the cache 50,000. This page buffers value is just valid for this connection. So if yeah. I didn't get the voice correctly, Matthias. Can you repeat this one? Can you repeat the question, please? Ah, okay. Let's see. Yeah. I don't know if it is a useful example here, to be honest. It just shows the capabilities of the execute application event rule type here. What the gstart call here does, it gstart with the age option here, it gives you the header page. It gives you the header page of your Firebird database, which is pretty much the output here, what we have seen. So with using gstart and the age option, you get this output here, and you can inspect the transaction counters, you can inspect the page size, the page buffers value, if forced writes is set on, and the sweep and the allowance. So they get this output here, and writes it to a file in case of the event rule type here. Yeah, so okay. Well, Matthias, thank you very much for the invitation, for giving me the opportunity to talk at the Delphi User Group, and to the Sydney people, enjoy the pizza, and probably I'm staying around here a bit. Or if you have any questions to the product or Trace API or whatever, just send me an email. Well, yeah. So thank you very much, and greetings to Australia, and have a good evening. I have to say, have a good evening. Yeah. Bye bye.